The scene unfolds in the silence of the night. A quiet house, dimly lit by yellow lights seeping through the windows, casting faint shadows over old furniture, relics of a time long past. The door has been closed for hours, but the echo of footsteps lingers, haunting the corners of the rooms where dreams once painted colorful pictures. Now, only the stillness remains, broken by a soft sob, not from anyone else, but from a person once adored, once hailed as a legend. In the darkness, the silence is overwhelming. Nothing but the distant hum of memories that have begun to fade. What was once vibrant, full of life, is now but a ghost, a lingering echo of a glorious past. The world had witnessed the rise, the fame, the adoration. But no one ever saw the cracks. No one saw the toll it took, the price that had to be paid to stand in the spotlight. The sounds of celebration and applause had long faded, leaving only the emptiness of a life that had once been full. Was this the price of fame? The cost of standing at the pinnacle of success, where every step was watched, every decision dissected? Or was it the silence of someone who had given so much to the world and yet found themselves lost in the very things that once defined them? What happened behind the bright lights, behind the applause? Few know the answer. The struggles, the personal battles, the choices made, each one had a price. These are things no one outside the circle could understand. The public saw the dazzling performances, the award-winning songs, the smiles. But behind those smiles were countless nights of solitude, of second-guessing, of fighting for something that no one could quite grasp. And now, in this very moment, as the world moves on, the silence speaks louder than ever. Joan Sebastián, the beloved poet of the people, stands at the crossroads of his legacy. His life, a series of melodies that once filled the hearts of millions, now lies heavy with untold truths. Behind his soft, poetic voice was a man who had witnessed the complexities of life, who had fought the battles only a few knew about. And in the final chapters of his life, he had decided to break the silence. Why had he remained quiet for so long? Why, after all the accolades, the fame, the recognition, had Joan chosen now, at the very end, to finally speak his truth? Was it a desire for revenge, for closure, or was it something deeper, something that had haunted him for years? The questions linger, unanswered, as the world waits for the final revelation. What if the real cost of being a legend isn't just the fame, but the emotional toll it takes on the person behind the persona? Joan Sebastián, a man who had once carried the hopes and dreams of his audience, was now ready to confront his past, to name the names, to expose the rivalries and the secrets. The world would never be the same again. But the question remains, what drove him to this point? What is the truth that Joan Sebastián, the poet, the artist, had been hiding all these years? Joan Sebastián, the man known as the poet of the people, had always been revered, celebrated, and even adored by millions. His voice, soft yet commanding, could tug at the heartstrings of anyone who heard it. His songs became anthems, a soundtrack to the lives of many. He had the kind of fame that most only dreamed of: awards, sellout performances, and the adoration of his fans. But this was not the entire story. Beneath the public persona, behind the glowing smile, there was another side of Joan Sebastián, a side that few people knew about, a side that he would carry with him into the quietest moments of his life. On the surface, everything seemed perfect. He had reached the pinnacle of success, cementing his place in the hearts of millions. He performed in grand arenas, recorded hit songs, and became a symbol of triumph for many. But there were cracks in the foundation that only a select few were privy to. Joan's rise to fame had not been easy, nor had it been free of challenges. He had faced his fair share of struggles, both personally and professionally. And as the years passed, these struggles began to weigh heavily on him. In private, Joan Sebastián knew all too well the pressures of living in the spotlight. The music industry, despite its glamour, was ruthless. Competition was fierce, and even those who were once allies could become bitter rivals. Behind closed doors, Joan had seen firsthand how fleeting the music world could be. The industry that had once embraced him now seemed to chew up its stars and spit them out, leaving only those who were willing to sacrifice everything for their careers. And Joan was no exception. His relationship with other artists was one marked by both admiration and competition. On stage, they were all peers, but offstage, the dynamic was often one of subtle rivalry. It was a world where friendships could quickly turn into feuds, where trust was a rare commodity. Joan had experienced this firsthand with many of his fellow stars, some of whom he once called friends. But as the years went on, the tensions became more apparent. The cracks in his relationships began to show, and the admiration he once had for some of his contemporaries began to fade into resentment. Take, for instance, his relationship with Maribel Guardia. Their story seemed like a fairy tale at first. Two beautiful, talented people coming together in a marriage that captivated the public's imagination. But behind the romantic images and the smiling interviews, their marriage was far from perfect. It was plagued by tension, jealousy, and competing careers. Joan, ever the busy performer, spent long periods on the road, while Maribel tried to balance her own career and her role as a mother. Their relationship, once full of passion, began to unravel. And when rumors of infidelity started to circulate, it only worsened. The divorce that followed was painful and messy, with both of them fighting over properties, rights to songs, and most importantly, the custody of their son, Julian. Though they tried to maintain a cordial relationship for the sake of their child, their interactions became increasingly strained. A symbolic duet during a charity event was supposed to bring them together, but it only highlighted the distance between them. Joan, unwilling to rehearse together, showed just how deep the rift had become. Maribel, hurt by his decision, took it personally, and their professional relationship deteriorated further. Despite their public displays of mutual respect, it was clear to those close to them that the connection they once shared was now nothing more than a facade. Then there was the case of Pepe Aguilar, the son of the legendary Antonio Aguilar. Joan had always admired Pepe's talent, but that admiration quickly turned into something more complex. The competition between them was inevitable. Pepe, with his famous last name, seemed to have doors open for him that Joan had to fight to get through. But it wasn't just about the name, it was about the recognition. Joan, who had worked tirelessly for every bit of his success, began to feel that Pepe was being handed opportunities based on his lineage, not his talent. This sense of injustice was something Joan couldn't shake, and the two were never able to overcome the quiet animosity that developed between them. Joan's relationship with Marco Antonio Solis was another example of admiration turned rivalry. Both were gifted songwriters and performers, capable of crafting songs that resonated with millions. But the constant comparisons between them in the media created a subtle tension. While publicly they spoke highly of one another, there was a palpable competition, one that neither was willing to acknowledge outright. The tension reached a breaking point in 2004, when a planned collaboration between the two failed due to creative differences. What was supposed to be a moment of unity became a symbol of their inability to reconcile their artistic visions. Joan's words, which were often laced with respect, carried an undertone of discontent. He saw in Marco a reflection of his own struggles, but also someone who, in his eyes, had not earned his place in the same way. And then there was Pedro Fernandez. Pedro, a versatile artist who had crossed into different genres, had a career that Joan had always respected, but their personal relationship was strained. It wasn't just about music, it was about the respect, or lack thereof, that Joan felt for Pedro's approach to the industry. There was a feeling that Pedro, despite his undeniable talent, had been playing the game with a different set of rules. Joan's resentment grew during their shared appearances at various events, where Joan felt that his position was being undermined. The professional rivalry reached its peak when they performed together at a charity event in Guadalajara. What should have been a celebration of their shared success became a battleground for egos. Joan Sebastián's world, once filled with admiration and accolades, was slowly being overshadowed by the harsh realities of fame. The very people he once admired were now competitors, and the relationships he had built over the years had become fraught with tension. His life had become a delicate balancing act, where trust was hard to come by, and loyalty was even rarer. The truth was, Joan's world had never been as golden as it appeared. Behind the curtains, the shadows were always present, and Joan was starting to feel the weight of those shadows more than ever before. Would he ever find peace, or was he doomed to live in a world where success was always measured by how much you could endure? It wasn't until much later that Joan Sebastián truly began to confront the reality of his situation. The music industry, as glamorous as it seemed, had always been a battlefield, one where only the toughest survived. But survival wasn't just about the physical endurance of endless tours and sleepless nights. It was about the emotional toll, the unseen scars, the weight of carrying not just your own burdens, but those of everyone around you. Joan had always known that fame came with a price, but it was only as the years wore on that he began to truly feel the cost. The first real crack in the foundation came when he realized that the respect he had once earned seemed to be slipping through his fingers. It wasn't an immediate change, but rather a slow, creeping realization that the music industry, which had once embraced him, was now becoming an increasingly cold and competitive place. Artists who had once shared his vision and dreams now seemed more interested in outdoing him, in taking his place at the top of the charts. What had once been a brotherhood of musicians had turned into a war for supremacy. But it wasn't just the external pressure that started to break him. It was the internal conflict that had always simmered beneath the surface. For years, Joan had dealt with the quiet resentment that came with success. He had worked hard to get to where he was, but no matter how much he achieved, it never seemed to be enough. His peers, his colleagues, the very people who had once shared in his victories, were now the ones who seemed to be undermining his position. The unspoken rivalries, the subtle jabs, and the quiet betrayals began to weigh on him more than the constant touring and the long hours in the studio ever had. The turning point came when Joan, for the first time in his career, found himself questioning everything. He had always believed in the power of music to heal, to connect, to bring people together. But the music world he had entered all those years ago had shifted into something unrecognizable. It was no longer about the art. It was about who could sell the most records, who could fill the biggest venues, who could win the most awards. The music had become secondary to the game of fame and fortune, and Joan found himself becoming weary of the game. It wasn't just the industry that had changed, it was also the people around him. Joan had always been a man of principle, someone who believed in loyalty, honesty, and integrity. But over the years, he had seen how those values were slowly eroded by the desire for power and success. His relationships with fellow artists had become increasingly strained, and the personal connections he had once treasured began to feel more like business transactions. The idea of true friendship, of collaboration, had been replaced by competition and suspicion. In the years leading up to his final years, Joan had started to withdraw from the very world that had once defined him. He became more selective about the people he worked with, more cautious about the deals he made, and more reluctant to share the stage with anyone who might not share his vision. The public, of course, saw only the glitz and glamour. They saw the performances, the awards, the accolades. But behind closed doors, Joan was struggling with something much deeper. He was struggling with the emptiness that came from having achieved everything he had ever dreamed of, only to realize that it wasn't enough. And then came the betrayal. It wasn't a single event that shattered Joan's sense of self. It was a series of small betrayals that built up over time. It was the whispered rumors that his songs were being stolen, the accusations that his success was due to luck rather than talent, and the backhanded compliments from those he had once considered allies. It was the feeling that everyone around him was trying to take a piece of him, and that no one cared about the sacrifices he had made to get where he was. He was no longer the beloved figure that had once captivated audiences across Mexico and beyond. He was now just another player in a game where everyone was trying to one-up each other. The betrayal came from within, from the very people he had helped elevate. The artists he had mentored, the musicians he had supported, and the friends he had trusted had all become part of the system that was slowly suffocating him. They had all become part of a world that valued success over integrity, fame over friendship, and money over art. Joan Sebastián, the man who had once been revered as the poet of the people, was now just another casualty of an industry that had chewed him up and spit him out. In the quiet moments, when the lights were off and the crowds had gone home, Joan would reflect on the path his life had taken. He would remember the early days when he had first picked up a guitar, when he had dreamed of becoming a voice for the voiceless, when his music was his only currency. But as the years went by, the dream became tainted. What had once been a pure expression of his soul had turned into a commodity, a product to be sold and consumed by an ever-hungry audience. Joan Sebastián had spent his entire career building an empire. But in the end, he found himself standing alone in the ruins, surrounded by the ghosts of his past, the faces of those who had once been his friends and allies, but had now become his rivals. The betrayal was not just a personal one. It was a betrayal of everything he had ever believed in, everything he had ever stood for. And as he looked around at the wreckage, he couldn't help but wonder if it had all been worth it. Could he ever find peace? Or was this the inevitable price of fame? A price that would forever haunt him, no matter how many accolades he had won or how many songs he had written. Joan Sebastián had spent his life chasing a dream, but in the end, it was the dream that had turned into a nightmare. And yet, he couldn't stop. Even as he felt the weight of the years pressing down on him, he couldn't stop creating, couldn't stop performing. It was as if the music had become the only thing that still made sense in a world that had become increasingly chaotic. For Joan, the stage was where he could escape, where he could leave behind the betrayals and the disappointments, if only for a little while. But the truth remained. The world he had once known was no longer the same, and neither was he. Joan Sebastián, the man who had once been a symbol of hope and love, was now a man defined by the scars of his own journey. His music would live on, but the man behind the music would remain a mystery, a man who had given everything to the world, but had nothing left for himself. Joan Sebastián's story was one of humble beginnings, yet it was also one marked by extraordinary determination and an almost relentless pursuit of success. The foundation of his character and his career was built on a series of deeply personal experiences, many of which shaped his understanding of the world. His rise to fame had never been easy, but it was those early years, those formative moments, that had set him on the path to becoming the iconic figure he was known to be. Born into a modest family in the small town of Juliantla, Guerrero, Mexico, Joan Sebastián's life was anything but privileged. His father was a humble farmer, and his mother, though loving, had a quiet resilience that Joan would come to embody in his own life. From a young age, Joan was exposed to the struggles of everyday life, the hardships of working the land, the challenges of growing up in a community where opportunity was scarce, and the power of music as an escape from those struggles. Music, for Joan, was more than just a form of entertainment. It was a lifeline, a way to transcend the difficult circumstances of his youth. His early exposure to the guitar, taught by his father, marked the beginning of a lifelong love affair with music. However, Joan's desire to be more than just another ranchero musician was fueled by something deeper. His dream was not simply to sing the songs of the past. It was to create something new, to bring his voice and his experiences to the world. He understood early on that, in a country where the music industry was fiercely competitive and often unforgiving, success would not come easily. But it was the drive to leave something behind, something that would outlive him, that would propel him forward. As Joan grew older, he began to see the contrast between his upbringing and the glamorous world of music he aspired to enter. The world he dreamed of was one where fame, wealth, and adoration were the ultimate goals. But it was also a world where the lines between authenticity and artifice were often blurred. The very things that Joan had learned to cherish, honesty, loyalty, and family, seemed at odds with the nature of the industry he was entering. Joan's family had taught him that the most important things in life were not material, but instead were rooted in the connections we make with others and the integrity with which we lead our lives. His values were grounded in a profound respect for those who had come before him, the ones who had struggled to carve out a life in a world that offered them little. He carried those lessons with him, even as he stepped into the limelight. However, as he began to gain recognition, Joan found that the world he had entered was not one that easily aligned with the values he held dear. The music industry, despite its emphasis on creativity, was driven by forces that were often beyond the control of the artists themselves. The pressures of commercial success, the demands of a rapidly growing fan base, and the constant competition from other artists all began to chip away at the foundations Joan had carefully built. The first signs of internal conflict came when he began to realize the disconnect between the person he was becoming and the person he had set out to be. He had risen to the top of his profession, but in doing so, he had begun to lose touch with the very things that had driven him to pursue music in the first place. He had made compromises along the way, small ones at first, but they had accumulated. The stage was no longer a place where he could simply express his soul. It had become a battleground where he was forced to fight for relevance. It was at this crossroads in his career that Joan started to question his motivations. He had achieved the fame he once dreamed of, but in the process, he had also encountered the darker side of the industry. The betrayals, the manipulations, and the egos that seemed to define every interaction left him disillusioned. The people he had once admired were now his competitors, and the admiration he had once received seemed increasingly hollow. Joan had always believed that music should be a reflection of the soul, an honest expression of one's inner life. But as he navigated the complexities of the entertainment industry, he began to see how easily that honesty could be compromised. The temptation to conform, to follow trends, to cater to what the audience wanted rather than what he believed in, began to weigh heavily on him. And despite the fame and success, he found himself feeling more alone than ever before. During this period of introspection, Joan often found himself thinking back to his roots, to the values his family had instilled in him. He would remember the days when his guitar was just an instrument of escape, a way to express his feelings without fear of judgment. He missed the simplicity of those early days, when his music was just for himself, before it became something that the world expected of him. Joan had always been an artist driven by the desire to tell stories, to share his life, his struggles, and his triumphs with others. But over the years, he had begun to feel like a prisoner to those stories. The songs that had once come so naturally to him now felt like obligations, forced out of him by the expectations of an industry that demanded more and more. It was during this time that Joan began to reflect on his legacy. What would people remember him for? The songs, the awards, the recognition. Those were all external markers of success, but did they truly define who he was as an artist? Did they reflect the essence of what he had set out to achieve, or were they just byproducts of a system that had long since stopped caring about the artist behind the music? His family, his roots, his principles, they had been the guiding light in his life. And now, in the twilight of his career, he realized that these were the things that truly mattered to him. But could he reconcile these values with the person he had become? Could he return to a man who had once dreamed of using music to bring people together? Or had that dream been lost in the pursuit of fame? As Joan thought about his journey, he realized that the true test of his character wasn't how much he had achieved, but how much he had remained true to himself along the way. The road ahead wasn't about reclaiming lost glory. It was about finding peace with the person he had become and the person he had once hoped to be. The music, the fame, the betrayals, none of it would matter in the end. What mattered most was the integrity with which he had lived his life. And in that quiet moment of reflection, Joan Sebastián knew that it was time to finally speak the truth. He had carried these burdens for too long, and the weight of the silence had become unbearable. The world would finally hear his story, not through the songs he had written, but through the words he had kept hidden for so long. It was time to let go. The aftermath of Joan Sebastián's career was not a sudden crash. but a slow, grinding erosion that took years to fully manifest. The consequences of his choices, the compromises he had made, and the toll that fame had taken on his spirit were felt in every aspect of his life. While the public saw the accolades, the hit songs, and the adoration of millions behind closed doors, Joan was dealing with the consequences of a life lived under the microscope. Fame had granted him success, but it had also stripped him of the privacy and peace he once longed for. The first significant consequence of Joan's rise to stardom was the strain it placed on his personal relationships. His marriages, particularly his union with Maribel Guardia, had been under constant scrutiny. What had once been a passionate romance between two stars had slowly deteriorated into a tense, emotional battlefield. The demands of their careers, the jealousy, and the public expectations had taken their toll. By the time their divorce was finalized, Joan and Maribel were no longer the picture-perfect couple the media had adored. Instead, they were two individuals who had been broken by the very industry that had once made them icons. Joan's relationship with his children also suffered. His son Julian, from his marriage to Maribel, grew up in the shadow of his father's fame. And while Joan tried to be present in his life, the nature of his career made it difficult for him to balance his responsibilities as a father and a performer. The long hours, the endless tours, and the demands of the industry often kept him away from home. Joan's children, despite his efforts to provide for them, found themselves longing for his presence. His absence, both physical and emotional, created a rift that would take years to repair. The strain on his family was compounded by the ongoing tensions with his peers. Joan's career had been marked by collaborations with other artists, but the underlying competition and unspoken rivalries had left scars that would never fully heal. The music industry, while full of camaraderie on the surface, was a place where the cost of success was measured in broken relationships and fractured trust. His strained relationships with other artists, such as Pepe Aguilar, Marco Antonio Solis, and even Pedro Fernandez, served as constant reminders of the compromises he had made in his pursuit of fame. But it wasn't just his personal relationships that were affected by the consequences of fame. Joan Sebastián's health began to deteriorate as well. The years of constant touring, the grueling schedules, and the pressure of maintaining his public image took a physical toll on him. What had once been a vibrant, energetic performer was now a man weighed down by the years of sacrifice. Joan's health problems were not immediately apparent to the public, but those close to him knew the truth. He had become a prisoner to his own body, a body that had once been his instrument of expression, but now betrayed him at every turn. The long nights, the sleepless days, and the constant pressure to perform took their toll, and Joan began to feel the weight of his years in a way that no number of awards or accolades could ever erase. Even as his health declined, the pressure to maintain his career continued to mount. The expectations placed on Joan were immense, and the demands of the industry never slowed. He was expected to keep producing hit songs, to keep performing for his fans, to maintain the image of the perfect artist. But as the years passed, it became increasingly difficult for Joan to keep up with the relentless pace. He began to feel as if he were a puppet, controlled by forces beyond his control, forced to dance to the tune of an industry that cared more about profit than about the artist's well-being. The toll of fame was not just physical and emotional, it was financial as well. While Joan had enjoyed immense success during the peak of his career, the financial pressures of maintaining his lifestyle and fulfilling the demands of the industry had drained him. The royalties from his music, the sales of his albums, and the money from his performances had allowed him to live comfortably, but the cost of maintaining that lifestyle had become unsustainable. As the years went on, Joan found himself facing financial difficulties that were compounded by the legal battles over the rights to his music and the distribution of his wealth. The very success that had made him rich now seemed like a double-edged sword, leaving him vulnerable to the financial and legal ramifications of his past decisions. Despite his enormous popularity, Joan often felt alone. The friends he had once trusted had become distant, and the relationships that had once given him comfort now seemed hollow. The constant competition, the jealousy, and the pressure to be everything to everyone had left Joan feeling disconnected from the very people he had once considered his peers. His world, once full of admiration and camaraderie, had become one of isolation and loneliness. This sense of isolation deepened as Joan began to withdraw from the public eye. He started to spend more time at home, focusing on his family and his personal life. The world that had once demanded so much from him now seemed to offer little in return. The adoration of millions, the applause of the crowds, no longer held the same appeal. What mattered most to Joan in his final years was the quiet moments with his family, the peace he found in solitude, and the love he shared with those closest to him. Yet, despite the toll that fame had taken on him, Joan Sebastián could never fully escape the pull of the stage. Music was in his blood, and even as he faced the consequences of his choices, he could not abandon the thing that had defined him for so long. Joan continued to perform, but now the performances were different. They were no longer driven by the need for validation or applause. They were driven by a deeper, more personal connection to the music. The songs, once a vehicle for fame and success, had become a means of catharsis, a way for Joan to reconcile with the life he had led. But no amount of music could erase the scars that fame had left behind. Joan Sebastián had achieved everything that most artists only dreamed of, but in the process, he had lost more than he could ever regain. His health, his relationships, his peace of mind, all had been sacrificed in the pursuit of a dream that, in the end, seemed both empty and all-consuming. As Joan reflected on his life, he realized that the price of fame had been higher than he had ever anticipated. Fame had granted him the world, but it had also taken from him the very things that made life worth living. His story was a cautionary tale, a reminder that the cost of success was not always measured in dollars or accolades, but in the toll it took on one's soul. And as he sat in the quiet of his home, surrounded by the ghosts of his past, Joan Sebastián knew that there was no turning back. The damage had been done, and the consequences of his fame would haunt him forever. Would the music he had created stand the test of time? Or would it, too, be forgotten, swept away by the tide of history? Only time would tell. But for Joan Sebastián, the real question was whether the cost of his success had been worth the price he had paid. As Joan Sebastián faced the twilight of his life and career, the inevitable truth began to weigh heavily on him. The once vibrant world that had celebrated his every success now seemed like a distant memory. The applause, the admiration, the bright lights, all of it had faded, leaving behind a man who, despite his accomplishments, was forced to confront the reality of his own limitations. The fame, the recognition, the accolades, all of it came with a price, and Joan had paid it, perhaps too dearly. The pivotal moment came unexpectedly, as it often does in life. It wasn't a grand event or a public scandal that forced Joan to face the truth. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation with a rival or a moment of undeniable loss. It was simply the quiet realization that the path he had followed for so many years had brought him to a place where he could no longer run from the consequences of his choices. The weight of his past, the regrets, the sacrifices, and the broken relationships, everything had caught up with him. And in that moment, Joan realized that there was no escaping the truth that had been buried for so long. He had always known that his career would not last forever. No artist's fame ever truly endures. The industry was too fickle, too fleeting. But Joan had always believed that as long as his music lived on, he would continue to have a place in the hearts of his fans. Music, after all, was eternal, or so he had thought. But the reality was far different. The industry had shifted, and with it, the public's attention. The very things that had once defined his career, his voice, his songs, his persona, were no longer as relevant in a world that had moved on. New stars had emerged, and the music that Joan had once created with such passion and dedication was now relegated to the past. He was no longer the poet of the people. He was simply a man, living in the shadow of a legacy that was fading with time. It was not the music that had failed him, but rather the world that had once embraced him. The pressures of fame, the constant need to perform, to please, to be seen, it had all taken its toll. Joan had spent so much of his life in the pursuit of success, in the quest for recognition, that he had lost sight of the very things that had brought him joy in the first place. The music, the art, it had all become secondary to the need for validation, for approval, for the approval of others. And in the process, Joan had sacrificed the very essence of what made him the artist he was. It wasn't until Joan had reached his breaking point that he realized just how much he had lost. The toll on his health had been mounting for years, but it was only when he could no longer ignore the pain that he truly understood the price of his fame. The long hours, the late nights, the endless touring. Each of these had taken a physical and emotional toll that no amount of success could ever make up for. His body, once strong and vibrant, was now a shell of what it had been. He had ignored the warning signs for so long, had pushed himself to the limit in the name of his career, but now there was no escaping the consequences of those choices. His relationships, too, had suffered irreparable damage. His children, his friends, his former lovers, each one of them had been touched by the strain of his fame. His inability to balance his personal life with his professional ambitions had left him isolated, alienated from those who had once been closest to him. The wounds were deep, and despite his efforts to mend them, the scars remained. Joan had always believed in the importance of family, of love, but the demands of his career had driven a wedge between him and those he cared about the most. The very people who had supported him throughout his journey were now strangers, their faces blurred by the passage of time. But it wasn't just the external consequences of his career that haunted Joan. It was the internal conflict, the battle between who he had become and who he had once hoped to be. The man he had once been, the artist, the poet, the dreamer, had been swallowed up by the machine of fame, by the need for success, by the desire for approval. The joy he had once found in creating music had been replaced by the pressure to remain relevant, to stay at the top, to continue to deliver. And as the years went on, the pressure became unbearable. The man who had once been a symbol of hope, of triumph, of resilience, was now a shadow of himself, struggling to find meaning in a world that had moved on without him. It wasn't just the fame that had damaged Joan, it was the way he had allowed it to define him. He had spent so much of his life chasing after something that, in the end, was ultimately fleeting. He had been consumed by the very thing that had once brought him joy. The music, the art, the connection with his fans. These were the things that had once filled him with purpose. But over time, they had become secondary to the chase for success. The drive to be the best, to be number one, had slowly eroded the very essence of what made Joan Sebastián who he was. The tipping point came one evening, when Joan found himself alone, reflecting on his life and the choices he had made. His body, worn and tired from years of neglect, ached with the weight of his past. His heart, burdened by the regrets and the mistakes he had made, felt heavy in his chest. And in that moment, Joan realized that there was no turning back. The life he had lived, the career he had built, had come at a great cost. And now, all he could do was face the truth. Joan Sebastián had lived a life of extremes, a life defined by both immense success and profound personal sacrifice. His story was one of triumph, yes, but it was also one of loss. The fame, the accolades, the recognition, it had all come at a price. And in the end, Joan had paid that price in ways that he could never have anticipated. He had given everything to the world, but in doing so, he had lost himself. In the quiet of his final years, Joan Sebastián came to terms with the reality of his life. The fame, the success, the accolades, they were no longer important. What mattered now was the man he had become, the person who had learned, too late, the true cost of fame. The years had passed, and the weight of Joan Sebastián's past could no longer be ignored. The music, the fame, the adoration, they had all been part of the story he could never quite escape. But in the quiet of his final years, he found himself confronting something deeper, something far more difficult to face than any public performance or award. It was the truth about his own choices, his actions, and the relationships that had defined his life. It wasn't a sudden epiphany, but rather a slow, steady realization that had been building inside him for years. Joan had spent much of his life running, from the pressures of the industry, from his own insecurities, from the loneliness that often came with fame. He had built a career on the back of hard work and determination. But now, in the stillness of his thoughts, he understood that the price of his success was far higher than he had ever anticipated. The relationships that had once defined him, the friendships, the family ties, many of them were now beyond repair. And though he had tried to make amends, some wounds ran too deep to heal. One of the hardest truths for Joan to face was his own sense of guilt. He had always prided himself on being a man of principle, someone who valued loyalty and honesty. But as his career had progressed, he had allowed the pressures of fame to cloud his judgment. The friendships that had once seemed so genuine had been tainted by jealousy, competition, and the relentless pursuit of success. And in the process, Joan had alienated those who had once been closest to him. His relationship with Maribel Guardia, the woman he had once loved, was a prime example of this. Despite their public appearances as a perfect couple, their marriage had been filled with tension, mistrust, and unspoken resentments. Joan had always been the one to put his career first, and Maribel had been forced to take a back seat. Over time, the love between them had turned into something colder, more distant. The divorce that followed was painful, but it was also inevitable. And though they had tried to maintain a cordial relationship for the sake of their son, the damage had already been done. Joan's regrets didn't stop there. His relationship with his children, especially his son Julian, had been strained by his absence. The long hours on the road, the endless tours, the constant pressure to perform, it had all kept him away from home for months at a time. And when he was home, he was often too tired, too consumed by his own personal battles to truly connect with his family. His son, now an adult, had grown up in the shadow of his father's fame, but Joan realized that he had missed out on the most important part of his son's life, the part that no amount of success could replace. As Joan reflected on his life, he couldn't help but think about the people he had hurt along the way, the rivals he had made, the friends he had lost, the family members he had pushed away. Each of them had left their mark on him. And while he had always been willing to forgive others, he found it much harder to forgive himself. The guilt weighed heavily on his heart, and it was a burden that he couldn't shake, no matter how hard he tried. But even as he faced these painful truths, Joan knew that it wasn't too late to make things right. The music industry had always been a place of competition, of egos clashing and friendships fractured. But in the end, what mattered most was the legacy he left behind. Joan had always believed that his music would outlast him, but he now realized that it wasn't just about the songs. It was about the relationships, the moments of connection, and the lessons learned along the way. In his final years, Joan began to seek out the people he had wronged, the ones he had left behind. He reached out to Maribel, to his children, to his friends and former collaborators, and he tried, in his own way, to make amends. It wasn't about erasing the past. It was about accepting it and learning from it. Joan understood that some things could never be fixed, that some wounds would never heal, but he also understood that the act of reaching out, of acknowledging his mistakes, was the first step toward finding peace. There were no grand gestures, no sweeping reconciliations. But in the quiet moments, Joan found a sense of closure. The regret that had haunted him for so long began to lift, replaced by a deep sense of understanding. He had lived a life that was both beautiful and painful, a life that had been defined by his art, but also by the sacrifices he had made along the way. He had given everything to the world, and in return, the world had taken much from him. But in those final years, Joan Sebastián realized that he had also gained something precious, the ability to accept himself, flaws and all. The world would remember him for his music, for his contributions to Mexican culture, for the songs that had touched the hearts of millions. But for Joan, the true measure of his life was not in the fame, the awards, or the recognition. It was in the moments of connection, in the quiet acts of love and forgiveness that he had shared with those who mattered most. As the final chapter of his life unfolded, Joan Sebastián found peace, not in the applause of his fans, but in the quiet moments of reflection, in the acceptance of the man he had become. He had no illusions about his legacy. He knew that fame was fleeting, that the world would eventually move on. But what mattered to him now was the truth that he had finally embraced, that the greatest success was not in achieving everything he had ever dreamed of, but in finding the courage to face his own imperfections and to make peace with the man he had been. And so, as Joan Sebastián took his final bow, it wasn't the music that defined him, nor the fame that had once consumed him. It was the quiet, introspective journey of a man who had finally come to terms with his past, his choices, and the legacy he would leave behind. As Joan Sebastián's story drew to a close, there remained an unspoken truth that lingered in the air, one that even he couldn't escape. His life had been a complex tapestry, woven with triumphs, heartbreaks, and a deeply personal struggle that few truly understood. To the world, he was a legend, a musical icon, a man whose songs had touched millions. But behind the stage lights, the accolades, and the applause, was a man who had lived a life of both immense achievement and profound sacrifice. In his final moments, Joan had come to terms with the reality that not everything in life could be fixed or undone. The mistakes, the regrets, and the pain that had followed him throughout his career were no longer something he could erase. But there was something more important that Joan had realized. He didn't need to fix everything. Sometimes, the key to peace wasn't in achieving perfection or reconciling every broken relationship. It was an acceptance, in embracing the imperfections that made him who he was. There was a sense of quiet resignation in Joan's reflections, a realization that the journey, with all its ups and downs, was what ultimately mattered. He had lived a life filled with passion and struggle, with moments of great joy and moments of deep sorrow. His music, the legacy he had left behind, would speak for him long after he was gone. But the true measure of his life, the legacy that truly mattered to him, wasn't in the number of records sold or the awards won. It was in the quiet lessons learned along the way. The most profound lesson of all had come in the final years of his life, when Joan had stopped running from the truth. He had stopped hiding behind the facade of success, the public persona that had long shielded him from the pain beneath. Instead, he had embraced the messiness of his existence, the complexity of his emotions, and the flaws that had defined him as much as his accomplishments. It was this acceptance that allowed him to find peace, not just with the world around him, but with himself. As the world continued to turn, Joan Sebastián would remain a figure whose songs and story would continue to inspire. His music would live on in the hearts of those who had been touched by it, a testament to his gift as an artist. But for Joan, the most important part of his journey had always been the search for meaning. It was a search that never truly ended, one that carried him through every triumph and every failure. In the end, it wasn't about reaching some grand conclusion or achieving everything he had once dreamed of. It was about embracing the imperfections and the unknowns that made life, and his story, uniquely his own. As the final notes of his life played out, Joan Sebastián left behind a legacy that was not perfect, but it was real. A legacy of love, of music, of struggles overcome and battles fought. It was a legacy that would continue to inspire and resonate with those who remember the man behind the music, the artist who had given so much and, in return, had found a deeper understanding of himself. In the end, Joan Sebastián's story was not one of unblemished glory, but of a man who had lived and loved with authenticity. His life had been one of contradictions, of highs and lows, but through it all, he had remained true to the one thing that had always mattered most, his music. And as his story closed, it left behind a question not for him, but for those who would remember him. What do we do with the time we are given? How do we make peace with our own imperfections and find meaning in a world that often demands more than we can give? For Joan Sebastián, the answer was clear. He had given everything he had, and in the end, that was enough.